Hello, friends and countrymen. This is Benjamin Boyce. I have scored us another fabulous interview with a young thinker. I have so much hope with this up-and-coming generation, the people who are being exposed to the collegiate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and who are actually thinking their way through it and, forming some antibodies against this ideology that is taking root in our society. So here's an interview with Kenny Zhu, who is a junior at Davidson University in North Carolina. Earlier this year, he started speaking on Facebook and a little bit on YouTube about his positionality within the whole progressive stack and how he doesn't necessarily even want to be conformed into that progressive stack as a Asian American male. And I came across his writing in the Federalist and watched some of his videos. I was very impressed with his presentation style and the clarity of his thought, and so I wanted to bring him into the light of your shining eyes. Check out his links in the description if you enjoy him as much as I did. Here you go. What was your first topics and how have they changed over the last few months?
Well, I talked a lot about Asian American identity. Within kind of the culture, that got a lot of traction. But I also talked about things like confidence and masculinity, and a kind of understanding what are the qualities that you need to kind of gain success or to break into this world, and what parts of that is this culture teaching, what parts of that is this culture not teaching. So I tried to be a little bit of a cultural investigator. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I've been interviewing people about the cultural dialogue and about identity politics because I was at a college where the identity politics went completely toxic. Yeah, Evergreen State College. And where there's actually an interesting story. Maybe, I don't know if it's proper to bring it up, but during the middle of the protests, there was this meeting in this room. It was this packed room, and the students were just yelling at the professor and at the president and at the administration, at the police officer. And one Asian female, and she's a foreign exchange student, I believe from China, she stood up and she expressed that the professor wasn't a bad guy, that you guys have the wrong idea about him. And she made like this connection between what was happening there and the struggle sessions back in China, and that he's not a bad guy, you guys have the wrong idea. And she was immediately hushed. And then another Asian male who was also leading the protest, she's like, you don't understand, we have light privilege. We have this other form of privilege. So she was automatically discounted in the middle of that because not the whole racial framework breaks down as soon as somebody has a different idea than what's driving it, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, that's a consequence of when your ideology and when your narrative is so tied to race and so tied to this collective identity expressed through race, then people who have in any way different views or different ideas from those expressed are immediately hushed or discounted or even shifted over to the enemy's side. This is a kind of zero-sum collective worldview, and this is the consequence of that. It suppresses dissent, and it cannot live with dissent.
Have you? Well, even though it prides itself for being super dissentious or dissenting all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a math major and a philosophy minor, but I used to actually be an English major, and I used to study a lot about the current literary frameworks that are forging through the world. And the biggest one now, besides postmodernism, is deconstructionism. And it's the idea where that's all the rage in academia. It really started in academia in the 60s. And once it took hold there, it really implanted itself into the educating community. And then now it's metastasized everywhere. And it really just says, okay, well, the entire world just lives in dichotomies. And it's up to us to break down the dichotomies and to be that dissenting voice of that breaks down the dichotomies and just shows people, all of the power, the layers of power and the superstructures behind everything. And I think that it's in itself, it does a service. It does explore how power dynamics shift. But what it fails to do really is it fails to account for the autonomy of the individual and the autonomy of how people can, as a unit, as an individual, and maybe even as a group or as a community, either learn to live through these power, or learn to not live through these power structures.
Dismantle. The first step is to dismantle them or critique them, right?
Yeah, well, critique them, talk about them, but also, kind of understand why they're there, kind of understand the history about why they're implanted in this way, and kind of talk about it through that framework.
And where did you pick up, you came across this in literary studies then?
Yeah, in English, yeah.
And have you taken that framework and tried to apply it to different things and see where its good part is and where it ends, where it starts to break down?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I was very interested in is studies of civilizations, and one of the history classes that I take right now is on East Asian history after 1850, and one of the big lasting themes right now in historical criticism is the idea of colonialism and the British Empire and the French Empire coming up and carving the Chinese Empire in the 19th century through the Opium Wars, through the spheres of influence, those kinds of things. And it's really presented to me in terms of this deconstructionism. It's really presented to me in terms of, these are the guys with the power, these are the victims. The Chinese people are the victims, the Europeans are the oppressors. They're the guys in power. They're coming in and they are just carving up this country, and it really paints them as imperialist aggressors, which is definitely not a good thing. And I'm not saying that that everything that they did is good. In fact, I'm not saying that most of the things that they did were good. But what I am saying is that, well, if you look at the entire world that way, then what about, how did China get into that position in the first place? Like, how did the Chinese Empire, which in the 18th century, by 1799, was the most powerful, most wealthy empire in the entire world. Literally, Europeans were awed by it. The U.S. was awed by it. People were wondering, how can we get Chinese goods? How can we get Chinese tea? They were obsessed with it. They're obsessed with China. How did such a powerful empire break down? And it's not just because imperialists came over and just attacked them and ravaged them. I mean, people did that for the past 10,000 years of history. It's because the Chinese Empire really internally broke down. They failed to embrace reform. They failed to embrace science. They failed to embrace technology. And a lot of the problems that resulted was their failure, not the result of European conquests. It only made them weaker towards the European conquest. So that's where this kind of framework breaks down. It's when you fail to see your own role in your own self-destruction.
Interesting. One of the things that you brought up in one of your videos is you were talking about the Asian identity, or the Asian American identity, and you brought up a really good point that when Asians are trying to be co-opted into the Hispanic and the Black narrative, into like that POC conglomerate. One of the things that is rarely brought up is that you guys have your own family structures, like your own parenting structures, and then you mentioned very briefly a relationship to technology.
Asian American relationship with technology is primarily dictated by, Asian American dictation of social status. I mean, who are the people that we respect? And a lot of the people that we respect are a lot of the role models that we have that look like us in this society are people in technology, or doctors, or people in medicine, or people in high-tech professional fields. That's where we see the highest status of who we are involved in American life. It's so why you
starts up a feedback loop then.
And therefore, that's why we kind of elevate technology a little bit more. But it's the same way, like if you are a young black kid growing up in the inner city of Chicago or something like that, and who are your role models? Who are your sports stars, athletes? And those are, and therefore you value that. You see that as your path. In a lot of cases, like this is the kind of mindset, and this is the kind of technological that kind of dictates our relationship with technology.
Yeah, and I was bringing that up because I was wondering if there was an internalized reaction to the way in which the colonial West conquered for a period of time the East and the Far East Asia. And if technology, if like the lesson was learned and internalized that technology is something that we fell behind on, and so we need to put that front and center. You also brought up the at least in China, civil service was a path towards status, and the only way to get into that was education. And so it seems like you were forming the narrative that's how education became so central in the culture and in how the culture pushes itself.
Well, one of the things that I deeply emphasize, I think, with my work, and which I continue to emphasize, is the idea that people don't change over a period of 5 or 10 years. The ideas and attitudes are ingrained in civilizations and races and ethnicities for centuries. So if the only way to really change a people is to change it over centuries. And so European influence, it came into China and it made the Chinese people, the Chinese elite, more concerned about technology. But that didn't bleed into the rural population until almost really 100 years later. Only by 1980 did China, by China, I mean like the people of China, like the peasants in China, actually really get the memo that they were behind and they needed to step up. And that was when we got this great growth in China that's lasting through now, and it's creating this new Chinese superpower right now. But it took a long time. It really did. It didn't take, some emperor said, we're going to create this giant technological reform. He tried it and it failed. It failed completely.
When was that? What period or decade?
That was at the late 1800s. That was 1890s. The emperor said basically, we're going to do this 100 days of social, political, and technological reform, and then the people of China were like, no, heck no, we reject it, and it failed completely.
That's a really interesting point, because one of the critiques that is pushed, or at least rhetorically pushed, by the progressive left is this idea of systemic inequality, or they want systemic change, and they point to systemic evils or injustices, and that's thinking about it in terms of time and not just space, like not just a system that's in place now, but if we're going to change the system, we have to change the people in the system and the attitudes of the people in the system. And the only way really to do that is to think generationally, is to plant the seeds in life. I was speaking with a friend who did a lot of research into helping inner city Black individuals get ahead in life, and the only thing that she came across that actually had an influence was somebody who's running some sort of social work, not business, but a nonprofit, where he found mothers who were pregnant and worked with them, and then guided the child all the way up, and that had really good results to push them out of the gravity well of the inner city situation. But that, unfortunately, that one guy, nobody's been able to replicate his work. So he had something special that he wasn't able to document. But when we talk about cultural change, I think it's wise to really look way down the road, in a way.
Yeah, well, the person that you talk to is a shining exemplar of that. I mean, basically, he has the right idea. If you're going to change people, you have to change the next generation. You have to start early. You have to start with education. You have to start building people up from the ground up. And you have to start by revitalizing these communities that are ravaged in cycles of poverty. Because poverty is not just an income level, it's a mindset. Really? And I think they fail to realize that when you are incentivized through your entire life to receive a check without doing anything, without having anything to give you dignity of work, then you will become accustomed to receiving that for your entire life. And that's how these communities, and if that becomes your entire livelihood, you need to teach people and do this graciously and do this with honor and show them respect and mentorship and really go into these communities and say, we want to eliminate poverty, but not by giving you a check, not by giving you money. We want to teach you the skills to help you to become self-sufficient.
Because money isn't really valuable if you don't know how to use it, if you don't know how to earn it, make it, keep it, and make it grow.
Well, Coleman Hughes, you had him on here, but he had this. He wrote this great article in Quillette called. I'm sure you've read it too, but the racial wealth gap, and with great evidence and facts, he really describes. He really describes that. When we compare white wealth and black wealth, on the surface level, it looks like whites have 100 times the amount of wealth of black people. But if you really look at the definition of wealth, wealth is earned income minus spending. And so he says at least 50% of that can be attributed to, he said at least 50% of that can be attributed to spending habits. What people are spending their wealth on, these are facts. This is the evidence. And if we were to live in the real world, if we're to have a real world problem solving, which I believe in, then we need to acknowledge the problem, which is that the problem is not just merely we need to give people more money, but we need to teach people how to spend it more effectively. There is a lot of good work going on. There's a lot of I think that if you really want to be, you really should be, and people are caring about social justice more and more. And I think it's important that we do care about it. I think that it's important that we approach it in the right way, in a way that will actually solve people's problems rather than just make us feel good.
You brought up in this article that you wrote for the Federalist called Asian Americans Don't Complain About Discrimination in the University, We'll Call You White. You linked to an article, of course, in Vox, where an author makes a case that Asian Americans are being used by the right to advance their agenda, to erode the foundations of affirmative action. And I thought it was ironic that it seems that the left wants to use that identity group and is accusing the right of wanting to use that identity group. And I think that identity politics itself is very open to abuse. I wonder if there's any way, how do we figure out where identity sits and how do we respect that? And how do we be aware when it's being abused?
We have to be aware of when but the term identity is being co-opted by a political force. People have political identities, and that's important. But it's important to separate your political identity from your racial identity. As I have a political identity, I also have a racial identity. My racial identity connects with my political identity, but it is by no means, it cannot be subsumed into it. This is the statement that is most horrendous to me about, I guess, what people on the left say. The most horrendous rhetoric that I've heard, that I hear very frequently in mainstream political discourse is this. We are the party of women, of blacks, of gays, of Asian people, of people of color. if you are a blank, you should vote for me. That to me is the most erroneous statement you could possibly make. The statement should be, if you believe in blank, blank, and blank, you should vote for me. Mm-hmm. If you believe in government welfare, if you believe in, if you believe in strengthening of teachers' unions, if you believe in the strengthening of marriage equality, if you believe in those kinds of things, then you should vote for me. Not, if you are gay, you should vote for me. If you are Asian, you should vote for me. Do you get the difference? Do you understand that?
Yeah, I do. It seems so obvious to me that it's a very suspect tactic to just claim all these identities as yours. It's like, how could they not think of that as inherently bigoted, and to just force to just claim this part of a map? Like if we're playing Civ 5 or whatever, it's like, well, all those barbarians are mine now, or like all these different other things. They're just mine. It doesn't matter if they agree with me or not. It seems so thick-headed, and it seems like it works though.
It works because people have actually been convinced by the academy, by the mainstream media, and by what's the discourse today. I mean, you go to my college today, Davidson College. I'm a senior here, and you go to freshman orientation, and this is something a freshman legitimately told me. He said, at orientation, there is this woman who is considered the diversity officer of our school. She is the diversity inclusion officer. That is, she is actually paid by our school, meaning that's coming from our tuition, from my tuition. My tuition is being used to pay for an officer whose only responsibility is to propagate diversity and inclusion initiatives. And she goes up in front of this group of freshmen, these impressionable young freshmen who think that they're coming to college to be challenged. And so what's the first challenge that she says? She brings out this chart, this PowerPoint. It has these like 3 tiers, and it says, and on the top tier it has white people, and on the middle tier it has like Asian people and Jews and stuff like that, and then on the bottom tier it has like Muslims and black people and stuff like that. And she's like, this is how society works. If you are up here, you are privileged. If you are down here, you are oppressed. If you're in the middle, you're like kind of both. And these are freshmen. These are freshmen. They have no idea. They have no idea how to counter that argument because no one's taught them how to counter that argument. Yeah. And this is what they get. And they even start to believe it.
It's just, when I was at college at Evergreen, they did the same thing in these diversity orientations. They made a chart, and they went through all these different categories of privilege, race, class, gender, sex, belief system, blah, 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 blah. And they just asked who's the most privileged person, and we all knew who it was. And I was just like watching them do this. I'm like, aren't you the party that calls all of your enemies Nazis, and you don't understand that that's exactly what Hitler did with the Jews? Like, he made all these categories, and he put the Jews on top and said that they're oppressing everybody, so we need to... What's the logical outcome of that? What's the logical outcome, other than resentment? So I don't understand how it can be justified at all. And furthermore, how they're getting these diversity officers. I did a random sampling, and it's almost as affirmative action for a very specific race. If you look across America, they're all the same race doing all these positions. We probably shouldn't bring that up because it might come across as racist. I'm not. If you look at it,
random sampling. It's random sampling.
It's random sampling. They're all blacks.
That's the most statistically expedient way you could do these things. But anyway, keep going.
Yeah, but they're getting paid $80,000 to $120,000 a year to do this, and then their secretaries and stuff are probably around $50,000 a year, 50 to 70. So it's a huge business, and it seems very politically motivated because, like you were saying, and maybe this is just kind of a correlation, not a causation thing, but it seems like the Democratic Party is feeding on this identity politic to create their base, and then the academic institutions are basically molding people to become Democrat. It's almost like an assembly line of ideology.
Yeah. Well, a couple statistics to corroborate that fact. First of all, tuition has increased sharply since 2000, since 1990. And much of that can be attributed to the increase in staffing for administration.
Yeah.
In administrative staffing, not increase in faculty, not better facilities. Increase in administrative staff has grown. And where does a lot of this administrative staff go? Well, a lot of it goes to things like these initiatives, like diversity and inclusion. And a lot of it goes to things like counseling, which, I mean, we can have a debate about that. We can have a debate about how many counselors you need. We can have a debate about those kinds of things. But a lot of these are politically motivated targets because that are motivated by certain of these tracks. So that's statistic number one. And then statistic number two is you can correlate the rise of this ideology, of this deconstructionist ideology in academia with the direction of political parties maybe 30 to 40 years later. The academia, I mean, when people of the deconstructionist motif came and were protesting in the 60s, they became professors. Yeah. And then those professors in the 80s and 90s preached these kinds of things and eventually took over the universities. And now the universities in the 2000s started to do this. And now as the universities do this, because academia is the feeder of all elite corporate and intellectual life, now you have the Democratic Party adherent to it.
Yeah, I wonder if... do you think that STEM is going to be increasingly more and more in trouble? One pattern that I've seen is the people who end up getting in trouble, James Damore, Brett Weinstein, they're very logically minded. And there's other examples too that I've interviewed. Just very logically minded people who see facts, who need to build things in a very specific STEM-like way, are the ones who, when they present the bad idea or there's this cognitive dissonance in the academy when it comes to certain facts, and the way that they deal with that is to shove people out, is to push people out. Do you think that there's going to be a cascade of STEM being more and more corralled to produce only certain types of thought?
Well, I think when I was a sophomore, when I was a freshman, I think one of my critical awakenings that awakened me to this idea of STEM losing its status and STEM coming under attack, actually, there's this junior while I was a freshman, we were working on the same consulting group, proto consulting group, just helping this predominantly African American middle class community figure out how to improve their community. We did a lot of surveys and did a lot of recommendations and stuff like that. And I thought it was a really good experience. We got to really do a lot of real problem solving. But I just remember this one conversation I had with this junior who was this education major. And I say, well, statistics show that we could improve this community by doing X. And her retort was, "Oh, well, I don't believe in statistics." And I was like, "Wait, what did you say?" And she's like, "Oh, I don't know. That's not something. I think that there's a lot of things that are biased and wrong and privileged about statistics." And I said, "Statistics is statistics. It is mathematical. It's the basis." I mean, I just went off.
Were you able to convince her, or?
No, of course it didn't convince her. When you're trained, your entire major is bent upon the fact that the world is a white privileged, an oppression, is this zero-sum dichotomy. When your entire worldview is that, one little jibe about statistics is not going to affect your worldview. It is so complete. It is so full circle. It has been tampered with and messed with, and now it has come in its final form. This is an airtight, not airtight in the sense like it is evidentially or scientifically airtight, because it's hardly, but it's airtight in the sense that it's complete. It has all of the markers of a religion, of a complete circle of
really
that you can adhere to, and you could even, so to speak, act upon and motivate you.
Yeah, you can live your whole life inside of that.
Yeah.
The question is it a good life, and does it create a better life for other people?
Yeah, that's the question. I don't believe it does. And
so that's a good segue into how to counter that, or what are how can we, this is the one thing that I'm really concerned with, and this is why I love doing interviews like this, is trying to think tank different little bits and pieces of how do we erode this, stop the momentum, or are we just going to have to ride this out and start planting seeds for a later generation?
Mm-hmm.
So have you thought about this? What's your path towards confronting this and confounding it in a way?
Yeah, I have thought about this. First of all, we have to reclaim what I would call the American narrative. So I'm a person, I studied English for a long time, and in English we talk about these superstructures and we talk about these narratives. And while I think a lot of it that I learned was BS, I think some of it, the way that we think about it, the way that they thought about it, inspired me to think about these kinds of things in a different way. Mm-hmm. The issue with deconstructionism is that if you keep deconstructing ad infinitum, you eventually arrive at nothing. Nothing to inspire, nothing to motivate, nothing to help you to understand the world in any way. And so we need to reconstruct the American narrative. We need to reconstruct why we are Americans, what's so great about America, why should people even think about the American ideal. We should reconsider why we have a constitution, why that was so incredible at the time, why it's still so incredible now, and then finally, why it's so fragile, why the American experiment is under attack, and how we have to respond to it in order to keep it. So I think, number one, what is so great about the American ideal? I think in my last article, I talked about the melting pot. And I talked about this is a huge part of the American ideal, because I too believe that America is a nation of immigrants, and America has always been a nation of immigrants. The way that we've treated immigrants has always been about this assimilation and integration. It has never been about separation. It has always been about, you come and we want you here. We want you in our life. We want you to participate in our story. We want you to bring your customs and your heritage with us. But we want you to learn a new heritage. We want you to learn what it means to be American. That's why we have a test for naturalization. That's why my mom and dad went through an onerous process to go through that naturalization process. Because we need you to, when you come to America, you are no longer Chinese, or your affinity, your loyalty no longer belongs to China. It no longer belongs to Sweden or England or Africa or Egypt or South Africa or any of those places, or Brazil. It really belongs to here and in America. And we're going to teach you about those ideals, and we expect you to assimilate to those ideals. And then in that way, we shift the discourse from privilege and oppression from privilege and oppression and the idea that basically all of these American values, the whole idea of America is just this terrible thing. This whole idea of America is just this white colonial experiment that's used to perpetuate oppression upon other people. We switch the terms of the debate to, okay, now let's talk about what are the ideas, what are the ideals that we have to live up to as Americans in this melting pot framework? Because assuming that we're going to teach them ideals, we have to teach them the correct ideals. But I think that that's a better debate. I think that that's a debate where the terms are framed better. When we talk about ideals and we talk about what ideals do we want to foster in people, rather than when we talk about how are we oppressive or how are we victimizing people today.
It's the difference is when you started speaking about assimilation and assimilating into America, my first question was, well, how does that distinguish how is America different than the Borg? Right? The Borg from Star Trek, there's this
I don't know.
Okay, well there's this square spaceship that goes around and it swallows all cultures and it assimilates them, and they all become basically this one entity, and they all speak in the same tone of voice and stuff. You're not familiar with it. It's kind of a meme.
I really should educate myself on that. I'm sorry.
That's fine. But so there's a negative form of assimilation where everybody ends up, in a way, progressivism, social justice progressivism, radical social justice progressivism, whatever it is a form of assimilation where people start to conglomerate together through various means, and they become a group, they become a coalition. How is that's still similar, at least on the outside, of America, the country of immigrants, the melting pot? What is the difference? What are the founding principles and how they work out? And is there a difference?
The extent and the extent of the way that we assimilate is a concern and a subject of debate. In fact, there's some very reasonable people who I like and that I follow who I disagree with on this issue, particularly Amy Chua, the Yale professor, who basically wrote this book saying, and these papers saying that Asian immigrants should not assimilate to America because when they assimilate to American culture, they lose what makes them great, which is their hard work. And basically, she thinks Americans are lazy. Oh, okay. So she's like, yeah. She basically thinks Americans are lazy, and that if Asian immigrants assimilate, then they become lazy, and that would be stupid. And I have the opposite perspective. I think Americans are generally more hardworking than. I mean, I can prove this with evidence. More hardworking, work more hours in the week. Than practically every other developed nation currently, except maybe Germany. But we have a unique work ethic in America that I think we should pride ourselves on, not try to degrade or destroy. But anyway, back to the question of assimilation, back to the question of the extent of assimilation. I think that there have to be sacrifices to be made. I'm not going to say that you can keep your culture entirely 100% and still come here and be an American. I think that you have to learn the American way, and in many cases, that involves sacrifice. When my mom and dad came here and they immigrated over here, the first thing they had to learn was English. Whoa! They couldn't speak in Chinese anymore to people. Language is a part of culture. Language is a part of the American way. And I know Spanish is making a huge thing in America. And by the way, I've learned Spanish since I was 5 and 6 years old, and it's important. It's a good language to learn. English is still the most important language. You have to learn English when you come to America, and there's just no excuse for it. If you don't learn English, you're not going to assimilate into this country. My mom and dad had to learn English. Then they had to get used to an account of American religious and cultural life. They had to understand that even though they may not believe the same things that Americans believe, they have to understand the things that Americans believe. Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition runs exceptionally in the American framework, and they had to understand that. And eventually, my mom and dad did become Christians. Some immigrants do, some immigrants don't. And if you do, good for you. If you don't, that's fine. But you have to understand it. You have to learn it. You have to really see this as part of the American framework. And in that way, you have to make some sacrifices. But in that way also, you can more quickly and expediently and more rewardingly become a part of the American fabric and have basically your experience no longer defined by what race you are or what country that you came from, but from the fact that you are an American.
The intersectional conglomerate is fundamentally weak because it's building a coalition on on a negative. It's building it on a oppression and trying to come around oppression rather than a more positive, upward going. Like, even though it says it's about justice, in my experience, it's always talking about privilege. It's always talking about oppression.
Its unifying factor is oppression. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder if that's going to lead to a eventual weakness of it, because it's uninspiring and eventually just too heavy to sustain.
Yeah, there are two problems with the intersectional conglomerate, and one is exactly what you brought up, in that it builds off of a negative. The unifying factor of intersectionality is the negative, is the victimization narrative. Basically, when you say to someone, I am black, so I am a victim, then you say, I'm Hispanic, so I'm also a victim. But then you say, I am black and gay, so I'm like twice the victim. Or you can keep going down this victimhood trail. And it's that, if that becomes your defining factor, then you're really telling people this. You're really telling people, I am so deep in crap. I'm so steeped in victim crap that how in the world am I supposed to get out of this? Like, you think that passing some law, or you think that basically voting for the Democratic Party is going to get me out of this, like 6 loads of crap that are upon me? It's not. People can't be expected to believe that. And then what you eventually get is people have no motivation to change their status. They have no motivation to say, okay, I'm a victim, but I'm going to escape victimhood. I'm going to actually try to rise above my station. Instead, they become the kind of person that not only accepts their victimhood, but touts it. Says, look at me, I'm a victim. And so that's problem number one. I mean, and obviously that is obvious negative repercussions for society. But the problem number two is that it's a fake coalition. It's a coalition based on nothing, based on there are no shared experiences. The black experience is one that is singular and one that is very important to American history, and one that I study frequently when I talk about both American religious traditions and when I talk about privilege and oppression. It's important to understand where black people came from in the history of slavery, and it's appalling and it's cruel. The Hispanic narrative is not that. The Asian narrative is not that. And I think that it is not just cruel, but just entirely offensive to black people to attempt to co-opt that kind of narrative towards people of other races or other beliefs.
Well, eventually what happens is that they use the victimhood to come together, but then when problems arise within the group, then that's when the progressive stack starts happening. And at least at Evergreen, and I see there's a pattern running through progressivism, is that there's always like a black and others. Like the black is the privileged category, and I think it that grows out of the theory of white privilege, so that black is defined in relationship to white. So now black has to be the privilege in this other category. So it's a very dichotomous thinking, but once that coalition's formed on oppression, as you said, on victimization, if there's any sort of tension, it will automatically only be able to be resolved by appeal to the genital size of your victim status, like that contest like starts happening.
For example, there's evidence, there's plenty, in fact, it's been proven that Hispanics in America actually live longer than white people. Not only do they're Hispanic Americans are the group that lives the longest in America, and social scientists are completely befuddled about this. Really? They're like, how could they live longer than white people? They must be they're oppressed. I thought oppression is linked to lower life expectancy or something like that. But actually, Hispanic people have a very decent diet. They have good family relations, and they have a lot of the factors that lead to higher life expectancy. And it's a paradox that if you ask any privilege and oppression theorist, they can't explain. But if you ask any person based in evidence and science, it's extremely easy to explain. And that is something. Would you say, oh, Hispanics are privileged now? No. You would say they just have a different culture, and this culture that gives certain pro-social elements that other people should emulate. Maybe white people should emulate that. But then it really complicates this whole dichotomy and really adds some okay, well, I want you to be a victim. Like, you keep yourself on the victim ladder. Because that makes things simpler for me to write my fiery academic tracks.
Yeah, and keep your job at Vox.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm going to link everybody to your channel and your YouTube channel. There's more videos on your Facebook, though.
Yeah. My Facebook is the place where I post a lot of things. I wish I could update my YouTube video more. I really should. But for now, my Facebook and my Twitter. Yeah.
Well, why not both?
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for joining me, Kenny. I'm gonna I'll let you know before I put this up, and I'll send everybody your way. It's great to give you a bit bigger of a platform to have your voice heard in the discussion.
Well, thank you, Ben. I'm really glad you contacted me, and I'm really glad for the interview.
All right. Well, happy trails.
Yeah,
Enjoy
absolutely.
your weekend. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. All right. You too. Bye-bye.
Ciao.